I don't think the timing could be any better based off everything that we're hearing in the news right now. So we're going to pivot a little bit. We're going to detour off of contracts. We're going to probably spend most of the time on these slides. Actually, the time as well again because we attended the manager meeting yesterday at RAAC. Peter and Shauna actually created these slides and they're fantastic. I think it's perfect information for everybody on this call in this meeting today. So he's the man. He's going to shed light on everything that we are concerned about, great positivity, and solve the world's problems. When you do this, just hit the down there. Yeah, I think it's the figure. There, you just got to okay, got it. Thanks.
Well, good morning, everybody. Yeah,
Good morning.
crazy stuff happening out in the world these days. Not really sure what I'm here to talk about. No. But yeah, so these are slides that were prepared. I can't take any credit on I prepared them, so we're just getting them. Thing that we'll call for today. So this is to go over specifically, and this obviously applies to the antitrust policy. That doesn't apply here. You guys are in the same brokerage. So conveniently, as you'll see in there, you are allowed to talk about your billing practices and other competitive industry standards or things that you guys want to in your brokerage here. So again, some of these slides may not apply specifically, but just so everyone's aware, if you're ever outside, like at a RAAC event, it's obviously never okay to be talking about, industry standard fees or set fees or, hey, I'm gonna start charging this commission come January or something like that. All of those things are potential antitrust violations, but the good news is when you're within your brokerage, that's not going to be an issue. So you're good.
No, I'm just making sure.
Okay. So, yeah, last Friday, there was some big news. Actually, I think it was 2 Fridays ago. I'm confusing it. I had March Madness this past weekend. So it was funny when those who were in attendance, I was not at the NAR executives conference. So they have an executive conference for Shauna and all of her counterparts pretty much throughout the country. This is kind of a regional basis to get together to talk about things. At the end of the conference, they put on their little spiel about NAR and what they're going to do and how they're going to vigorously defend this lawsuit, and they're going to take it down to the very end and then kind of little lawyer quip at the end, but we're always looking for potential avenues to settle if it makes sense. So that was on Wednesday that they had that, and then Friday morning they make this announcement that they settled the lawsuit. So what exactly does the settlement mean? The settlement means that NAR and the plaintiffs have reached a proposed settlement agreement on behalf of home sellers. So this is ending the claims brought on behalf of home sellers. It does not apply to your home buyers. There is presently class action litigation that's going on. Well, a larger class actually than the 500,000 plus plaintiffs from this Merle lawsuit. So what is going on? They have reached this agreement. It is still subject to court approval, but essentially it's going to end litigation for pretty much all of NAR members. So all of you who are members of NAR, most of the brokerages, except for a few that are still excluded who have not otherwise reached settlement agreements. Although it does provide an avenue if they do want to do that of being able to reach those agreements. So it's kind of always the question, why does anybody settle a lawsuit, right? When I first took over representing a municipality, there was an employee who was actually caught looking at pornography at work. We had it on camera, we had it on video and everything else, and we ended up paying this employee $2,000 to leave. And the big question is like, why? Why would you spend public taxpayer money to pay this employee who was caught in this egregious act to go away? And the reality is that financially, sometimes it just makes sense to do that rather than to pay me $5,000 to make this person go away, and then they're going to appeal it. Then we have to pay court costs and all these other things like that. So at the end of the day, why did NAR choose to settle? I don't know. I don't represent NAR, but some of the indications that we have received were first and foremost, they want to reduce the significant strain on the members and provide a path forward. They said that even if they won this lawsuit, right, there's still going to be appeals. And this doesn't prevent somebody else coming back and filing the exact same type of copycat lawsuit representing different plaintiffs in a different class action. So this way it kind of resolves all of that and provides a path forward. It also, again, they say that at the beginning, they have two goals. They're going to secure a release of liability for as many of the members, associations and MLSs as they could, preserve the choices consumers have regarding real estate services and compensation, specifically cooperative compensation. The Department of Justice is really hammering in on not allowing sellers to compensate buyer agents for their services. Basically an outright prohibition. So even if your seller says, I want to do that and I'll consent to doing that, the DOJ says we're not going to allow that, or we don't want to allow that from a legal perspective. So they are saying if that is really what the writing is on the wall, then we need to do a better job to try to protect that from happening. And a way we can do that is through this resolution of the lawsuit. The proposed settlement achieves both of those goals and provides a path forward. And ultimately, NAR leadership believes that it was the best outcome they could achieve. The financial implication is they would have had to post a bond to the tune of, I think, $5 billion. And that would have bankrupted NAR. They would have had to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. So this way, they don't have to do that. They have some ways to pay off, although it does include a financial settlement. There is an avenue to pay that off at a little bit more favorable terms. So who was covered by the settlement? Obviously, NAR. Any NAR member. So the over 1 million NAR members, all state, territorial, and local realtors associations, including REAC, all association-owned MLSs, all brokerages with an NAR member, as a principal that had a residential transaction volume in 2022 of $2 billion or below. So what about those who are not covered? Any NAR member who's affiliated with Home Services of America. So any of those companies, because they are still the last remaining corporate defendant. Your brokerage has settled the lawsuit, so you are out. But in any event, Home Services of America is still involved as a brokerage. So they can still construct their own settlement agreement. They're trying most likely to do that now, or they're going to fight it. But that's going to be on the deal that they can structure, and however that looks, not associated with this settlement in particular. The brokerages with over $2 billion in residential sales volume in 2022. However, there is a mechanism through an appendix that they would have to adopt that they can be included, basically opt to participate. And there's a way that they're going to have to pay into that compensation of that $400+ million settlement in order to be covered by the terms of this lawsuit. So basically, it's a pay to play. If you want to be covered by, you have to pay a percentage of your gross revenue.
How much did we take off so far?
And also MLS is not wholly owned by realtor associations. Again, I think there's only one, the West Penn in Pennsylvania, as Sean said yesterday, that is not wholly owned. But in any event, there is a mechanism just like that that would allow them to be covered under the settlement if they desire to do that, or they can simply work it out and try to negotiate the best settlement they can. What are the actual terms of the settlement? So
I know, Matt, don't rub it in.
Liability going forward. Sorry, is it good? Okay. So the good thing is that NAR, all of the members, anybody who has that little R designation after their name is going to be released of liability from the seller's action, class action law. Okay, it doesn't apply to the buyers, it applies to the seller. NAR is also going to pay $418 million. It's going to be over 4 years. We have a slide that will show how that is lump sum up front, another lump sum within 30 days, and then a periodic payment over the rest of those 4 years. Compensation offers, the main thing, compensation offers are moved off of MLS. You can no longer offer any type of cooperative compensation to an agent inside of an MLS listing. Now, what you can do is you can still offer that off of an MLS. So if you have a brokerage website, if you have some other means of communicating that within your office of saying, hey, we are willing to do this, picking up the phone. I know it's kind of scary to a younger agent, but pick up the phone when you say, hey, I just scheduled a showing and you want to be proactive, you call that agent and say, hey, guess what? My seller's very incentivized and we're willing to offer cooperative compensation. You're still allowed to do it. You're just not allowed to offer that or make any reference to that really in the MLS. And again, it applies to showing time. Don't get creative. Don't add an associated doc that just has cooperative compensation, terms. Don't try to create a website that is just going to list cooperative compensation for all these listings. In terms of your brokerage, not a good idea because that will likely be covered under the terms of the settlement. And if you're kicked out, you're still going to be subject to then potential litigation and liability. Another main one, and this is kind of the no-brainer, we should always have been doing this. I know many don't, but make sure you're doing it now. Make sure you have a written agreement with your buyers before you're doing any type of service for them. So if you're going to, show them a listing or take them out somewhere and show them listings in terms of some showings, make sure you have a written listing agreement with them before you're doing that. We even before all of this happened, we always kind of said that there's like these plants that PAR and the Real Estate Commission would send out to try to, see if you're going to say any fair housing violation, terms or things like that. Be on the lookout. That could be happening now where buyers are saying, hey, I'd like to show you or have you show me some listings, but I don't want to sign a listing agreement or a buyer agency agreement with you. Can you do that? So be sure you're saying, no, I'm sorry, I can't. But if you sign this, we'll do it for a day. We'll do it for a property, right? We'll limit it to 123 Main Street, and then I'll go show you that. And as long as you don't buy 123 Main Street, then you don't have to work with me. But make sure all of that stuff is in writing, because if not, as an MLS participant, you're going to be in violation. And lastly, NAR, most importantly, they continue to do or to deny any wrongdoing. They always think that cooperative compensation should be offered, and if it is offered, just should be disclosed. How are they going to pay? As I said before, there's a lump sum, $5 million within 30 days. Again, the agreement has to be approved. It hasn't been approved yet. So all of this is hypothetical. If it is approved within 30 days of that approval, $5 million, $197 million in 90 days, and then $72 million annually for the 3 years after. They're not going to increase your dues. They've determined not to do that for 2024 retroactively, I guess, or for 2025. And they're making the commitment that although will be taken into consideration by the finance committee, they're not going to make any decision to increase dues solely on having to make this payment. If you do the math, there's about over 1 million members, $418 million, it's $418 a member. Okay, if they pass 100% of that on to you all. So it's not earth shattering. Hopefully that doesn't break the bank. I know sometimes people struggle to pay the annual dues to NAR and to PAR. That's I completely get that. But at the end of the day, they are making this commitment that they will not pass that on to their members, at least at the outset. I will take off my NAR hat, not that I wear one, but obviously it's a self-funded organization. They have investments, they have foundation, things like that. They get funded through your dues. So it is your money at the end of the day that's going to pay that. But they're making that commitment to you that we're not going to increase them in the short term. Don't put any offer of compensation in the MLS. That is the new rule. So the way that this applies is if you are a member of NAR, you are prohibited from putting any offer of compensation in any MLS. Okay, think of it that way. Doesn't mean you can't put an associated document in there that says, please refer to my brokerage website. And on that brokerage website, you have your listing and an offer of compensation there. That's fine. Okay, as long as it's not in the MLS itself, or you're not linking someone to something that solely has the offer of compensation contained. Okay, so throw in a little bit more information, have the same listing duplicated, but then have that down there at the bottom that will show what that split is, as long as that's not in the MLS itself. Continued, like you said, it's an option for consumers. So as long as the seller agrees to do that, there's nothing that prohibits it. The hard part now is that your buyer's not going to know that. Not going to know just by looking at the listing whether or not cooperative compensation is offered. So realistically, if you have a listing, and hopefully you do, that has like 30 showings that are lined up, instead of getting potentially 30 offers, you're now going to maybe get 30 phone calls in advance that say, hey, are you offering cooperative compensation or not? And I know it sounds funny, but that is legitimately how it play out. Remember, NAR has a code of ethics that prohibit Article 16. You're not allowed to offer or to ask a cooperative broker to share or to modify compensation other than what they have really offered. And at this point, they haven't offered anything. The MLS used to be that offer. You would put that share of that cooperative compensation in the MLS. That's my offer. I bring a buyer. I've now, met the terms of that contract, and you're going to share. You're not going to know that. Okay. So now the reality is, when you send an offer over, you're likely going to have to include, or, I guess a few ways to play this out. First of all, you pick up the phone, you call the agent, they say, hey, yes, I'm offering cooperative compensation, make an offer. Here's my percentage, X%, Y dollar amount, whatever it is. That works with you and your client. That's within whatever you worked out with your buyer agency agreement that you have, right? Because you're showing property to this buyer. You then say, all right, thank you for that. And you're going to send over potentially the form CBC. And I know that's a scary form because everybody says, oh, I can't send that over with my agreement of sale. I'm asking that broker to maybe change something. In this case, you're not. You're just asking them to confirm, hey, we had a conversation at, 3%, 4%, 10%, 100%, whatever it was. All I'm doing is asking you, listing agent, listing brokerage, to sign off and say that is what we've agreed to, okay? And I'm also including it with an offer that's coming over, but you're not asking them to change. Like they said, hey, I'm offering 3%, and you say, well, I need 3.5. So I'm gonna send over an offer that's contingent upon you changing the offer that you've made over the phone. That will still be an ethical violation unless they change that Article 16. So be aware of how you negotiate this. But nothing prohibits you, hey, offer cooperative compensation, that works. I'm gonna send over a CVC to make sure that we're paying that. No offer of cooperative compensation, okay? Or maybe the listing broker has worked with the seller and says, we're not even gonna offer that, but what we will do now is offer a concession. We're gonna give a percentage or a dollar amount to the buyer to let them use it however they want. So if they need it for repairs, if they wanna use it for a home warranty, if they wanna use it to pay for their buyer agent, they can do that, and we'll make it at X% or Y dollar amount, whatever that is. And that's how that process will likely potentially play out. But again, all of this is up in the air. Business models may abound, but currently just don't offer it in the MLS. You can still offer buyer concessions. Those are permitted in the MLS, but don't say buyer concession contingent upon buyer agent or compensation for buyer agent or any reference to cooperative compensation, okay? It should be concessions, buyer incentivized, buyer willing to offer concessions. And what you'll see now is the commission percentage goes away in your listing, and you'll see likely a concession tag that's there. And now you'll have to fill that in if your seller is willing to offer anything in that. This change goes into effect mid-July, subject to approval from the court, and again, subject to approval from the DOJ, and if they're willing to go along. What should listing brokers now advise their clients about the prohibition on offers of compensation on an MLS? Inform the clients that they will no longer be an option on the MLS. So you're going to have to get creative if you want to offer that. You've never had to offer it. You've never had to, as some agents will say, pay the fair share to the buyer agent. That's not a thing. You're worth what your clients agree you're worth. And if the seller is going to pay you, that's great. And if not, it falls back to the buyer. That's how you have to explain it. It's not going to prevent offers of cooperative compensation off of the MLS. It will not prevent the seller from offering buyer concessions on the MLS, like we said, and it will continue to be negotiable and always be negotiated between the agents and the consumers that serve. You should never be agreeing to accept anything or modifying anything without your client's consent and their, okay. How will offers of compensation be communicated if brokers can't use the MLS? Does this just make broker compensation less transparent? The answer is yes. So, it does, in reality, you're not gonna know going in, this is the offer, this is how it's going to be paid. So the reality now will be, you are going to have to, as a buyer agent, prepare that buyer closing cost and include your fee on there. And basically have it in parentheses or with a little asterisk there that says, you may have to pay this, you may not, depending on the offer of compensation. And like I said before, when you make that offer now, how will the offers of compensation be communicated, likely via the phone or via the off MLS practice. Okay. Settlement does not change the ethical duties that NAR members owe to their clients. So you still have an obligation. You can't say, oh, I'm not going to show you any properties where they don't offer cooperative compensation, right? Because you can't know that now. You can't know that in advance unless you're picking up the phone to make that call. Any existing listing agreements? What about those? Am I still allowed to offer cooperative compensation? Am I allowed to do it in the MLS? No, you are not. So after the new rule goes into effect, you have to modify and amend those listing agreements. And that would be the proper thing to do. And most importantly, all of the MLS data entry is going to have to change so that those will no longer be a visible field. Likely, like I said, a switch to commission rather than cooperative compensation. And it expressly provides that sellers may communicate the seller concessions via the MLS, provided that the concessions are not conditioned on the use of or payment to a buyer broker. Okay, so I'm offering 3%, use it however you want. And now the safe thing to assume is if I'm offering 3%, don't assume that's 3% plus the 3% that you're expecting to get from your buyer, right? That 3% is 3% of the purchase price as articulated or the dollar amount. So if your buyer now needs closing costs, you need to modify that to say, hey, we need 3% for closing costs. Plus, we would like you to cover this cost either by sharing cooperative compensation, CPC form, and if not, you can ask the seller to pay that directly as a buyer or for them in form EAF, like we talked about last. Written agreement for MLS participants acting for buyers. Again, this should always happen. We always say if you don't have a buyer agency agreement, you are representing the seller when you take a buyer through a home. Okay, so even if you're saying, oh, I think you should make an offer here, you should do this, you are treading in unethical territory, you're treading in potential antitrust territory, all sorts of other things. So now make sure you have that. Anytime you're working with buyers, make sure you have to enter into the representation agreement explaining how that representation works. If you look at the language, it talks about we're showing homes or providing those services. Just be careful. You know, if you have a sight unseen purchaser, I imagine title companies in light of this will now require those written agreements before they're going to share any commission or allow that to be paid. So just be aware of that. You may not get paid unless you actually have that. And now you could be in violation of your requirements based on protection under this law.
Are those forms are gonna be changed, listing and buying agency?
Good question. Yes, so that we'll get into that in a second. PAR has said that they're going to work actively and very closely with everybody, with Forms Committee, especially to try to review those, to take a look. Because right now it does talk about all compensation, putting that in the MLS without it laid out. So they will be revising that. I'll talk about it too. I think Article 16 will have to change as well, because you're not really making an offer of compensation in the MLS. You're negotiating that almost like a commercial deal now, saying, hey, I want you to pay that cost. So, but yeah, the forms will be changed. We'll have more information hopefully regarding. How will buyer brokers get paid now? The same way they always have. So you do a fixed fee. I'm going to get X% by dollar amount. You can always do a concession from the seller or by the cooperative compensation. So when I talk about concession from the seller, that's not the listing broker admitting to their percent that the seller is paying them. That is the seller saying, I'm paying my listing agent and I'm also paying you buyer agent this percent based on a different arrangement. Okay, the cooperative compensation, that's the listing broker compensation. So even if your seller has said, I'm not going to offer cooperative compensation or authorize you to, they could, I don't know why from a financial perspective, but I guess they could agree then to pay the listing agent and then also pay the buyer agent separately. And that's Form CAS. So it was always an ethical violation to ask the listing broker to modify, never an ethical violation to ask the seller to cover that as a cost. Okay. We always get the question about, and I think I said last time, be careful of the loan products. The PAR, actually NAR has come out and is working with lenders. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, at this point in time, do not consider a seller paying directly under that second option as a concession for the buyer broker services as an interested party contribution or an IPC. So the IPCs are what are limited in terms of the loan product. That's normally, you only allow 3%, 3.5% of an interested party contribution. So these are things that are typically paid by a buyer that a third party or the seller usually is paying. The way that this is worded right now, and again, you have to be careful. I don't know why NAR feels comfortable doing this, but a payment by a seller of a buyer broker's services right now, at least based on tradition and custom, is a traditional and customary cost paid by a seller. And I'll say that again. So the buyer agent services, right, for the buyer agent to provide services to the buyer, the way that the real estate industry, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, the lenders view it, is a service that is traditionally paid by the seller. And therefore, because it's not something traditionally paid by a buyer, it doesn't fall under the interested party contributions. So it's outside of the IPC, so it doesn't fall within any percentage cap. That's the good news for your buyers, for your FHA, or your Fannie Mae, your Freddie Mac buyers. Kind of the bad news is, as we'll get into, it doesn't do anything for your VA buyers who are absolutely prohibited from paying any cost associated with that. So we're working with the VA, we say being PAR, being NAR, no resolution. This is kind of a funny one, but it's not serious, so don't worry. How can I ensure I'm getting my fair share of my listing commission? As a buyer agent, there is no such thing. Don't ask your value. Again, talk about your value. We don't recommend anybody cooperating one way or another. We just recommend that you disclose that. And that's the ethical requirement. That's the legal requirement. How can listing brokers explain why an offer of cooperating compensation could be a good move for buyers? There's great resources that NAR has provided. It should not be, no one will show your home if you don't offer it. You shouldn't say that now anyway, because no one will know when they show your home whether or not you're offering it. You know, explaining why, again, it might be beneficial for someone who may not be able to afford it, for a VA buyer in particular, right? If you're trying to get the widest net that you can cast, the widest number of buyers, that could include some VA buyers who otherwise have access to some very attractive loan products that make it a little easier to buy your home potentially. But at the same time, they're not going to be able to stomach that cost. Legally, they can as part of the loan product. So think about ways that can work. But again, it's never, that's how we do things. It's the industry standard. Our county does it that way. You know, our brokerage does it that way is one thing. And if you guys want to do that, defer to your broker and your designated realtor manager. But at the end of the day, it's never that's how our industry does it. Be very clear when you're talking.
This question might, I'm sorry, but how about the sellers, help for, buyers? Is that can be used for any of that compensation or not?
Yes, again, yes, that's where the interested party contribution should exclude that. So the limit on the loan product is going to limit the interested party contributions. Right now in time, IPC does not include a seller paying for a buyer agent cost. So that should, as of right now, through Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, that doesn't include, doesn't fall into that threshold in terms of that dollar amount. But that can proceed, again, based right now. Now, the problem becomes IPCs, the interested party contributions, are based on tradition and custom. And if the tradition and custom is that buyers' fees, buyer broker fees are no longer paid by sellers, will now be paid by buyers more frequently. That will then fall under IPCs. It will be subject to that limit because IPCs are seller or third-party covered costs that are traditionally covered by a buyer in a non-FHA or Fannie Mae deal. So that's where that can change. That's how it's kind of evolving. And it's almost the more we push in the other direction with the buyer doing it, the more we're now going to put a restriction or prohibition on a buyer potentially being able to finance that in addition to what's going on. So, question? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
At the very beginning, you said DOJ is basically they don't want sellers paying buyer agents at all.
That's right.
So like we're essentially, it's not whether they're paying a commission, it's the compensation. But like the verbiage is kind of screwing me up.
So they don't want a seller at all to be able, or really a listing agent to be able to compensate a buyer agent. I think they'll go as far as saying a seller. That shouldn't be an included cost that a seller can make. So what NAR is doing is trying to hedge that a little bit by saying, okay, we know you want to kind of drive the buck off the ledge and pivot that. If we can settle this, we can still allow our sellers to offer that. They can still offer the seller concessions. They can still offer cooperative compensation up until the point that, you know, the law changes and they no longer allow that. So I think they see the writing on the walls that even if they win this lawsuit, DOJ, they're still going to be up against the wall and have to continue to fight against several seller plaintiffs, against, you know, buyer plaintiffs in order to preserve the right to do that. So you're still allowed to offer cooperative compensation, still allowed to offer concessions. I think if the DOJ got their way, they would take all of that off and say, buyer, you pay your services, seller, you pay your.
That situation, then the only way buyer money.
Correct, seller consent, that's right. And if the DOJ would allow it.
That would be like.
Potentially, yeah. Now the DOJ federal, obviously, they could put some pressure on Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac to say, we're not going to allow that to then be included if you have that type of loan. That can't be on the HUD. You're not allowed to do anything off HUD. So that's the other way they can assert that pressure. But yeah, I think people will get creative. And that's really the way it is if your seller doesn't want to outright say, I want to share that cooperative compensation, you can always say, okay, then be ready. They may come back and ask for a seller concession. And what is that dollar amount?
So we're looking at maybe like there's gonna be literally no.
Right, no, I think you're gonna see that and you will continue to see that based on the terms of this settlement, even after July. Nothing will change as it relates to that. If the Department of Justice, I think, got their way, that would be the end result. You would never see that again. You only see buyer agents. Either you would see unrepresented buyers or you would see buyer agents who can afford to pay for the buyer agent services. Or, as we'll talk about, you'll see a business model that will change where maybe buyer agents charge a lower set fee in order to take them to the showings and things like that, understanding that's not a cost that a lot of buyers can afford. Or more realistically, they just won't have representation. And you as a listing agent, it's like, well, you're now gonna have more work, right? Because you're gonna have an unrepresented buyer where you're gonna have to walk through the process and make sure everything's done.
So
Yeah, good luck.
really quick, so coming back to the DOJ and the settlement, if this settlement is approved, does that say DOJ agrees with it and
No.
DOJ won't come back? So DOJ can still come back even if this settlement is approved? Okay.
A year ago, they came back and said, we no longer agree with the terms of the settlement, we struck them. Literally, like they sat down, and I hate to draw the analogy, but the same thing happened with Bill Cosby, where they sat him down and said, hey, confess to everything and we won't charge you. And then later on, they came back and they charged. Now, some could say rightfully so. But at the end of the day, that's the same thing. NAR sat down with the DOJ, negotiated a settlement. They say, as long as you do these things, that's why the board of directors, anybody who sat on the board, we do an antitrust resolution at the beginning of every year. There's certain things were prohibited, that REAC antitrust statement stems from that. And then they came back and said, well, the DOJ, we're really satisfied with that. We're not gonna abide by it. So we're now in litigation. It's on appeal to try to enforce through NAR. But again, all of that stuff is just kind of the DOJ is out there doing their own thing, and we'll see. I feel confident though. I think if the court, the public, if people are happy with the way that this is going, they'll kind of stay in their lane, and I don't think they'll be too active. But you've seen what they're pushing for with the West End one. They don't want any of that to be allowed. So who does it really benefit? Yes, ma'am.
So from what I understand, our commission, our compensation, so we all, I can't say that. There is,
You're in a broker.
there's a percentage that's charged for service and then a flat broker fee. But the max we can accept is the total compensation that is being offered to us. We can't do that plus then charge a flat broker fee. The max is whatever is offered.
You can.
Yeah.
If you said to your buyer, I'm gonna do X% or Y dollar, and the seller is actually, maybe they're offering more of this. You've agreed to like, well, the number's 2.5, you're going over 3. You need to go back to your buyer and say, because it's an ethical violation to accept a commission other than what you. So you go back to your buyer and say, hey, don't worry, this is no out of pocket to you, but they agree to offer free. I just want to confirm you're okay with that. And you get their informed.
I understand that now.
You can do with your buyer, you're allowed to once get their informed consent.
Typically now we would say 2.5% plus X flat broker fee. We're only allowed to take 2.5%, which will include that flat broker fee. We're not allowed to add anything else.
In terms of the settlement, you're saying that should be,
No, the max we're allowed to accept is what we agree to with our people. So, yeah, and I understand that we're not supposed to be going back to them and making any of those changes after the fact.
yeah, you can. You have informed consent. And you can, I mean, that's the thing is, if you say, hey, this is taking a little bit long, you know, I know I've agreed to that. They say, yeah, absolutely, you've done it. We'll give you 3 and then you get caught. The issue is you're not allowed to accept anything differently negotiated
Okay.
unless you get
So
there.
let's say I said 2.5% plus X in broker fee.
Yep.
And seller is only offering 2.5%. That's max we can get. We're not getting another broker fee.
You can go back to your buyer if you want to ask for that. Yes.
Because absolute covenant on the contract.
Yes.
You had, so if you did 2.95 and 2.5%, and the seller's offering 2.5%, you're getting the 2.5% plus the 2.95 because it was already stated prior to you doing that.
Yeah, nothing changes that practice. You are allowed, your buyer, please compensate you, your buyer's allowed to partially compensate you, your buyer's allowed, you're still allowed to collect your broker fee or your admin fee or whatever you want to call it. As long as you have that in a written buyer agency agreement. And that's the hard part. If you don't, that's where it becomes an issue. But to your point, that shouldn't change. You're not maxed out, you're not capped, as long as your buyer's aware of that and you have that.
Dive on this. So, I also understand because all of our friends in the industry got on like lab coat agents, all kinds of other Facebook groups and talked about, chirping about ways we can do this through other entities, that they've now said that any third party that is fed from the MLS, which would be our brokerage site, which would be my site, which would be Showing Time, which would be Zillow, it's not allowed, they're forbidden to advertise a commission.
The MLS for your.
Yeah.
Which again, should not, I mean, data entry, data is probably complicated. But yes, as long as there is not a direct feed, that's the same thing. Everybody's like, oh, Showing Time, that's the easy thing. Showing Time has the direct feed, so that's the same. Yeah, it's the same thing. You, even if it's not a direct feed. Correct. So even if, and just to hammer that in, even if it's not a direct feed from the MLS, but you have a separate website that has nothing of your list, you just have 123 Main Street, 6% commission, 3% split to buyer agent. And that's it. And you don't talk about the property or anything else. That likely will also violate the settlement agreement because you created a third-party website for no other reason other than to address the cooperative compensation sharing. So as long as it's built into your broker website, without that third-party fee, you're sued. Yes.
And we talk about the house and then we put in the broker.
You absolutely can do that as long as it's not in the MLS. The prohibition is on
Facebook, social media.
social media. Yep, absolutely. Yep.
So wait, question for Ryan. You know, Ryan in here. You know, is the KWLS that's in command, is that fed through the MLS? Yeah.
That's it. The brokerage will have. Brokerage will have to. So again, here.
I get back to what Mindy was saying about, like, if you have a buyer agency agreement with 2.5% and your broker service fee, but then you find out that the sellers are willing to give a 3% broker service fee. From what I was reading, you can't go back and change your buyer agency. You have to accept what the sellers are offering. Are you saying you can go back and do a change in terms? Or yeah.
You can always say I told my, but it requires an informed consent.
Okay.
And informed consent is written. That's where I would go back to them and you do a modification to your buyer agency that says, I'm allowed to get, although it's 2.5, I'm going to get up to 3%, but assure them it's because the seller agent's offering that and I'm not looking to step in. But you can always do that, but you can't hold it over their head. It's very delicate in how you do that to not run into an ethical violation. But in this instance, that's out of sight, out of mind to them. Hey, they're willing to pay you. That's great. Question will now become knowledgeable about this. Well, couldn't we lower the purchase price then by 0.5% or whatever?
Right,
And
you're buyer. They could keep.
why it requires the informed consent. And again, it's about how you have that conversation. I always say the form, great form. But if you go over the form and say cooperative compensation, you have to do it here, okay? And we'll go down to the next one. It's different than saying cooperative compensation is a means of allowing me as a listing broker to cooperatively compensate a buyer agent for bringing the buyer because I can't represent all buyers. See the difference? It's, all right, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that versus here are the options and that's how it is. But to your point, you absolutely can go back, and I would be very hesitant to accept that higher commission without informing them and making sure that they're aware of
Okay.
that. That makes sense?
Yep.
I had Brian and then.
Yeah, so
Yep.
talking about the showing time link. Like, wouldn't it be easier just to disconnect the showing time link from the MLS instead of referring everybody to different broker websites?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
we all. Be a charter.
I remember when that person scheduled appointment.
I think, like I said, not only brokerages are gonna potentially change the models, but you have third party needs that are gonna be the same. And again, maybe IDX is gonna say, hey, if we want to add that, if we think that there is value there, maybe we no longer have that today.
Right.
But I think to that point, if that starts happening before July, you can start to get creative of other ways we can maybe get that net a little wider to have more activity. Other questions? Yeah, go.
Give like a 50,000 foot description of where this came from.
Yes, so the way that it was explained in the court, they looked back 500,000 plaintiffs over a very long period of time, not too long, back to like the 2000s. And they saw a pattern that listing commissions were typically at about 6%. They looked internationally to like Great Britain and to Israel, specific developed countries, and they found that the same services were provided for anywhere between 1 and 2%. And basically, they're saying if that is what's going on, that's fine. But if there's a policy that is forcing people to do that or has created that atmosphere, that could potentially be anti-competitive because there's an organization, NAR, who had a cooperative policy that back since the 1990s has said really encouraged cooperative compensation and has promoted that. So the way that they look at an antitrust violation is they say, is there a policy that this business entity has in place? And NAR admitted that, yes, we have this clear cooperation policy. The next question is, did that have some type of impact on the market? And they were able to show over 500,000 listings that, yeah, commissions were typically at this 6%. Therefore, sellers are financing or paying for commissions. It's built into a purchase price. That's the standard. We really had no option because you have this policy. And therefore, there's this antitrust violation because you created this fixed fee, this fixed 6%, regardless of how it's shared. So that kind of, you can break it down. So you cut scratch, maybe I get it. Buyer side is the real plaintiff, in my opinion, because if I'm the one who's now had to pay an extra 3% on top of a purchase price, I have to finance it, I have to go. That is really, I think, the avenue, and that's where, remember, you're released from seller liability. You're not released from buyer liability yet. That's gonna be, but that's kind of, if that makes sense, 50,000, you know.
So it's not, I was hearing a lot of speculation that this was coming from COVID and what has happened to the market since 2019, 2020.
I will say they don't. People, as prices have increased, that everyone else is getting rich or getting a hand in the market potentially. I will say for title insurance, where you're insuring more value, so obviously you potentially should be at the risk-based direction or decision. But at the end of the day, I don't. I think it's based on the history, and that's it. The scary thing with the plaintiff side on the buyers, they're going back to like the 1990s. Their initial, before they treble the damages, they're looking at about $1 to $2 billion. Successful.
What is that case? Could you like give a high level?
Same thing, it's in the lower courts right now, it's being ferreted out, but that if any of your clients are getting any of the postcards, not about the class action, but if they're saying that they bought a house within this time period, they're asking them to join in the class.
But what
I think it's in the Western District of Pennsylvania.
but what are they feeling that, what is the case like?
So the buyer is saying that because this, you were saying that the 6% has been established, my purchase price has been 6% higher.
Okay.
And therefore I am out that amount of money because I had to finance that in because that was the industry standard. Which to me makes more sense than the sellers who are like, wait, I got 3% more purchase price, whatever, but their position is I'm paying a cost I shouldn't have to. Buyers are saying I think because this cost is.
So here at the beginning, like, it's not a secret, buyers are going to struggle with this added cost until loopholes are found or financing options. If our buyers say, I will not pay this, are we allowed to only look at houses that are offering it? Like, if they, well, you're asking,
Yeah.
right? So if I now come back to my buyer and say, well, they're not offering, we say no. So on the flip side, my question now is when we're giving a listing, a selling spiel, we're not saying this is the way it is, but am I able to say, look, there may be buyers who may eliminate your house because they cannot afford this? Are you able to have that kind of conversation? Okay. Because you're not telling them, look, if you don't pay it, but you're saying, look, buyers may exclude your home because they can't afford it. Okay.
It's really talking about the value and saying, VA buyers in particular.
Right.
You're excluding this. They're, the veteran down the street or somebody who's looking to buy in this area is not gonna be able to buy it. That's just.
But it may be
Well-
by your personal choice to
Correct.
include your home because they can't.
Absolutely,
Okay.
yeah, nothing is prohibiting a buyer from saying, I need someone.
So we can pitch that to our.
Yes.
Appropriately, like.
Well, what I will say is, offering cooperative compensation, or you move that conversation with the agents, no. Think creative, I mean, you can always send that form CAS and say, I know you're not willing to share, but is your seller willing to contribute? Say, hey, maybe it's not 3%, but are they willing to give us, a 1.5 or something like that, that at least I can help my buyer, and it helps them a little bit more, maybe they're not VA, they should do that. And in that way, think of it to your seller as seller concession.
So the buyer agent, if you reach out and say, hey, are you offer, is there a compensation? And you go back and say no, they could choose, say, all right, I'm not, that's enough. All your due diligence is asking, bringing it back to them and they're saying, okay, I'm not looking because they're not.
Because if I've asked them to share, the listing agent to me, they said no. The other option is we can just ask the seller directly and say, hey, seller, are you willing to pay me?
In the
As the
2 to
buyer?
3 days that it takes to do these showings.
Correct, yep. And that's like, if you look at commercial real estate, it moves a little bit slower, or more slow. This is all negotiated in the LOI. If anybody has ever done commercial real estate. When I have a listing and I'm bringing a buyer typically from that and I'm representing the buyer, a lot of times in those commercial listings, they may not have known what that cooperative compensation is. What they're gonna do is I'm gonna craft an LOI and I'm gonna say, hey, my buyer's gonna pay, $1 million. We're gonna finance at 6% over this number of years with this lender, and listing agent, listing brokerage is going to share X% or Y dollar amount for buyer brokerage buyer service. And that is part of the offer. And that's, I think, more and more, we're going to see these offers. And I think the other question is, you're going to be sitting down with your seller and they're going to say, well, what's the industry standard, right? Well, there is none. Well, what are other people offering in terms of cooperative compensation? Well, it used to be easy. You could go to the listings and people, oh, can't do that anymore. So you may have a seller who says, let's not do anything. Right? Let's wait and see what the offers look like. I might get 5 offers. Nobody wants cooperative compensation. I don't even need to think about it. I might get 5 offers and everyone wants it. And now I have to think about it. I might get 5 offers, 3 want it, 2 don't. And now it determines the nation. Now, the other thing to think about here is you have to be very careful with what they're looking at when they're making those offers and those selections, because Fair Housing Act violations, other type of issues that can come up. Why did you select this one over that one? Was it just this interest rate? Was it just that? So again, a lot of issues that are still being ferreted out, but those are mostly the things that you have to be aware of. Again, a seller's gonna say, how do I know what other people are doing? Because I've never sold my house before. This is the first or second time. And how do I know, more importantly, if I'm doing it, that I'm not gonna put myself at a disadvantage, and what are the benefits, what are the pros? And that's where you go to the competition.realtor. You say, there's certain buyers out there, you're in a $250,000 price range. First time home buyer, you're in a great area, but FHA, VA, they're gonna be people who might need those financing options. And if you preclude them, you really might be driving down the value of your. I just wanted to get through.
Is there some place we
There
can
we
go with the other lawsuit that's brewing right now in Western PA? Is there any place we can go to read up on it?
Yeah, I'll try to find an article,
Okay.
that I can sit around. It's really, I mean, they're trying to gather stuff. They're in like the very preliminary stages of it.
I'd like to read
Yeah,
about it now.
and I think a lot of it will be impacted by this. This
Yeah.
will, have a big result, but. So the Form BAC says that if the buyer broker's fee is paid cooperative compensation, the buyer will pay it unless it's a different agreement. Again, we have that form, CAF that we already kind of talked about here. What's the status with the Department of Justice? As we talked about before, the DOJ does not like this. They've already weighed in on the MLS payment statement and the settlement that they have, saying we don't want sellers to pay this fee whatsoever. So that is another matter, I think, that has pushed them to want to resolve this issue. Will there be changes to the FAR form? Yes, there will. They are going to be actively involved with the form committee, adopt any necessary changes as a result of the agreement. Again, waiting till after July till this goes into effect, I think, really reinvigorate that. This does not stop all lawsuits. Again, it's only those brought by sellers. Does not address the suits that have been or might be brought by buyers. It's unclear how it might affect any state level antitrust lawsuits because this was a federal law. Federal court, state court are different. Oftentimes they're not going to compete, but at the same time, they still raise those and say, hey, I might have exhausted my federal level claims, but I still have state level claims that I'd like to bring. Will there be more broker business models introduced into the marketplace? That is completely up to you guys and what you want to do. There's already a variety of those models. We don't, and RAYAC obviously doesn't encourage any one model. Everything is negotiable between the realtor and their clients. A little spiel we have to give. What does this mean for the real estate industry? Nothing really is changing, I think, in terms of the way you guys are doing business, except you're not going to see cooperative compensation in your listings. Always should be doing your buyer agency agreements in advance, have those in writing, even if it's for a day or, limited property. And again, nothing should change. You're just going to likely have to do a little bit of work, pick up the phone, make a phone call, find out, is that cooperative compensation being offered if your buyer wants to do it? And also thinking about how you're going to start communicating with your client about this, right? You're going to have a buyer who says, I can't buy a home without it. Or you're going to have a buyer who says, I'm flush, I don't need it. I'm perfect. This is great. Don't have to make it all. You have to have, a way to navigate that. Remember, nothing is industry standard. Everything is new. Any reduction in the fees? No, it's hard to tell. But I think logically that's going to be a question. If you're not offering cooperative compensation and previously you had been, shouldn't you be cutting that in half, right? Because previously the whole basis of the lawsuit was that we had to share it. So now if you don't have to share it, you still get that windfall. That's in the mind of the consumer. Remember what I said before, though, buyers may no longer be able to afford representation. Your job as a listing agent may now be getting more difficult. Okay, you may be doing more work. So you're now going to have to justify to your seller why you're not interested, or maybe interested, may not be interested, in negotiating on that commission, because your work volume is now going to increase potentially if you're not offering, whether you're offering it and how that plays out. Yeah, up to you guys and how you do it. Will there be a reduction in real estate agents as a result of the settlement? We had 26, almost 30 new members in orientation on Thursday 2 weeks ago. So if that's any indication, that's like the most we've had in forever. The pre-licensing classes are still up very high. I don't think that that's going to change. However, it's always a possibility. Will home prices go down? That's no, they will not. That what Shauna said yesterday, if you're waiting to buy a home, probably not the best thing to do. If interest rates do go down, there's a whole bunch of millennials that are chomping at the bit to get a home, and that's going to impact prices likely. And the way that values are working presently, they're not going down. So that's three. What should we do about the misinformation in the media? You just have to do your homework. Refer to the realtor sources that they have, refer to your brokerage sources. Again, it's not Chicken Little, the sky is falling. Might be a different way or avenue to do business, but I think it's still offering the same value. You're still have access to the same information. You're still going to be able to, provide great service and negotiate contracts with your clients. It's just a matter of communicating that and making sure you're aware. You cannot finance commissions at this point in time. Still not able to do that. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. If you're interested, you can read all the fine print, but they view it more as a personal loan. It's not tied to the real estate. The other question is, will appraisal values be impacted by more seller concessions? It's tough, and anybody who's an appraiser, if you're an appraiser, I'm not speaking out of publicly. It is as much an art as it is a science. You could have two identical appraisers and come up with two separate values for whatever reason. The way that I view value and the impact on value from seller concessions, if I had given you $5,000 to fix a structural issue in the basement, that should impact value because the value of the home was down by $5,000. I had to compensate for you. If I'm giving you $5,000 because I haven't gotten all of my junk out of the home on moving day, right? Should that be a concession that impacts value? No, I'm just a messy seller. I haven't been able to get my stuff together. That's on me. That shouldn't impact value. The problem is, though, we're getting away from commission. We're getting away from that identification. So a lot of times somebody was just going to offer a concession, right? How are you going to know 2% went to a buyer agent, 1% went to fixing the basement, right? So a lot of times what I think may happen with this process, they're just going to look at concessions and say, okay, it was a 3% concession. The true purchase price or the true value goes down by 3%. So be aware of that. It could impact the value. Still a lot of questions that remain unanswered. What about loans? Again, VA, they're still working with them to try to do that. And no update as of yet. I'm hoping that will be sometime before the end of this year. Federal law will be very, very soon. This is your little pitch. What should realtors be doing? Get educated, understand your buyer representation agreements. We got great forms. There's all of yours. Directly communicate your value. Learn to effectively communicate how the buyer's agent can be paid, what the options are, and the fact that everything is negotiable. Have buyer consultations as part of your little repertoire that you go through. Little, practice sessions in case an agent says, hey, how do you get paid? What's the basis for that? Go over those par agreements, make sure you understand that. And lastly, the mindset, this is John's main thing, focus on the opportunity and not the obstacle. There will be an opportunity, I think, to get some creative business models out there. The problem is, I think, if people rush to the bottom to try to take advantage, you still have big bullseyes on your back. So you're going to be subject to some scrutiny and some lawsuits. So just be aware of how you do that. But I think the main thing is number two, really your value. When an agent called up and says, or a client, I heard you're not allowed to charge a commission anymore, right? Fight the misinformation, give them the information and express your value to them that, hey, I have access to this information that you don't, and I can really provide that value. And when you look at this is the largest purchase that you're ever going to make, or the largest sale of a home that you're ever going to make. You need somebody who knows what they're doing to guys that process. So I think that is it. Yep, it's not allowing me to go any further. Yes, go ahead.
How about open house? How does
Sure.
open houses look now? Towards a listing agent, or if you're not the listing agent and doing an open house for somebody?
I think if you have someone who is asking questions, you're going to want to bring along some buyer agency agreements. And not to say you have to force them to sign it, but I think a great way to say, hey, I have some questions. What can I call you or whatever and say, law now requires me to have this in place. So I can't really get into specifics, but I'd be happy to answer those questions as long as the sign is be aware, dual agency issues abound, whatever those are, but that's the way I said I'm really not allowed to work with you or to answer any of those questions. So we do this, but I think you'll have to have those, or at least some type of broker fee agreement there that shows this is what's going on. And if they say no, you have to punt and say, I'm sorry, I can't provide services as a buyer agent based on the law without having this.
So you can still show an unrepresented buyer the house.
Opening the door, saying hello, welcome. If you have questions, here's my card, but I can't answer really any of them until you sign me here. Oh, we're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the way that. Yeah. I mean, how many times have you guys worked with somebody and know them or the referral and you don't even bother with the consumer notice, or you explain it to them, but you don't have it signed. It's one of those things that fell through the cracks. So you're going to make an offer, you send in the consumer notice, the buyer agency, the seller's disclosure, all the addendum. That's just something that I think has to become more of a formal. So I think you're going to have a consumer notice and a buyer agency agreement at every buyer agency consultation. And you make it for a day, or you just say, hey, before we work together, we have to have this. So, yes, sir.
We were at the meeting yesterday. We talked briefly about enforcing broker agreements, buyer agreements. I've never enforced one. It seems like a PR nightmare where I live, but what's the actual process for?
It's up to you, and it's up to the dollar amount, so that it's a contract, and you can sue at the magisterial district court as long as your broker fee is less than 12 grand. Or you can sue at the court of common pleas. It's a breach of contract. So, yeah, and we've done that. I've done that on behalf of several licensees. We had a client signed a buyer agency agreement. They went and showed them the home. It was a for sale by owner. Then they kind of went around. Oddly enough, then the seller got an agent to work with them. Maybe some ethical issues went about, but then they tried to cut them out of had sent the forms and everything else, and then said, no, thanks, I don't want to use you anymore. So we filed suit, took them to, I think it was MDJ Oberdorf. Got a judgment, they paid us. So, yeah.
I mean, that's gonna be basically something that we're all gonna have to do.
Yeah, potentially. I think it's. Yeah, you're gonna be a few who are gonna call your bluff probably and say, and honestly, I've had that conversation with clients right now that have an enforceable agreement. Client went behind the back. Agent, I tell them you have a great case, and they just say, to your point, it's a PR nightmare. This person goes on my Facebook page and just blasts me. Is it really worth $5 grand commission, whatever? I got to pay your fees. But I've had ones where they're really screwed the agent, and it was worthwhile to do it. So,
And one other question, Jay and I were talking about, agents that have variable rate listing commissions, can you shed any light on what that looks like in this scenario?
yeah, I think you could still, so the variable rate, as I understand it, is a lot of times as a listing agent, you'll say, hey, I'm gonna collect X%. And in the event that a buyer, agent from another brokerage, not myself, brings somebody, then I will share cooperative compensation. You're still gonna pay X. If I bring the buyer, then potentially that drops to Y or whatever that looks like.
Yeah.
Again, as long as that is communicated with the seller agrees to it. And then from the cooperative compensation, as long as whatever you are offering is what you stick, then those arrangements are still fine. That's fine, as long as, again, that's the main thing, as long as it's communicated. The only thing that is changing, you cannot make an offer of cooperative compensation in the MLS, and you have to have a written buyer agency agreement. That's it. So your practice shouldn't change absent those two things. And really, absent the one thing, which is just putting this up in the MLS, because you should always have your buyer agency.
Then we'll, one more item, so you're in the weeds about this a little bit, but the current buyer agency agreement. Third item down.
Yep.
Says that will accept what's offered and the ones above, or if it's less than.
Yep. And what's,
So,
well,
is it
except we're talking about
that?
the MLS, I think, too, or there's a reference, that will be changed. Yeah, that's part of the buyer agency listing agreement, they're gonna change based on.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, likely Article 16 as well, because that references, making an offer that, and specifically article or standard practice 1616, which is making an offer that is contingent upon the brokerage modifying what's been offered in the MLS, it's no longer gonna be. Yes, ma'am.
So what is the conversation in the meantime until this is approved to these buyers and sellers who are getting whiff of this, but it's not approved, but we're not having, it's an antitrust thing, like, if they're bringing it up right now, or about, like, what kind of conversations are we
You
having?
go over your buyer and see. The change, the only thing I'm not allowed to do, as a listing agent, the only thing that we're not allowed to get. Know in advance as a buyer agent is whether or not this cooperative compensation gonna be offered. So when you go over your buyer broker agreement and you say, hey, there's two ways here that I really get compensated. First way, cooperative compensation or the seller.
So you're really reiterating that it's always been this way. You can offer what you want, we just can't.
This has never been required to offer it.
Because everyone sees dollar signs now, right? So this is coming up, this is. Right now, how we present it, it's still.
I think that a good way, you are, and say that they have done a great job with their form explaining this. The way that these lawsuits, they're out in other states, their
Right.
forms are not the same as ours, but these are literally the only two ways I get compensated. The seller offers it, and if not, if they don't offer this total amount, X or Y, I'm gonna be looking to you to make up that difference. Or we can ask the seller, if the listing broker doesn't do that, we ask the seller to make it up by way of. We're not gonna know unless we get the property, I think.
Sellers trying to probably start making these changes, but the difference right now is as buyer agents will be able to see it in MLS right now.
If buyer, they don't wanna see property.
You at least need to be proactive. You could probably see these changes happening with the seller to do less. But it'll be logistically at least more sound right now. And then a nightmare answering the phone later.
I will say Shauna. President of, right. And Shauna, standing meeting once a month. The record, they didn't even ask a question about this at their meeting like a week ago. No, it's not even on any radar really local level. So whether or not like liar, it's clear, no.
Oh, they're away. They're away.
Yeah.
Just to go back to, so going into July, when the changes go into effect. If you have a listing agreement signed that, say, for example, like we have a listing agreement signed, but it's not gonna be marketed until June. And it's not under contract and when this goes into effect in July, we're gonna have to go back and redo listing agreements or, okay.
What's likely listening, because it does seem about putting that offer in the MLS and marketing.
Yes.
I think we need that offer. I think more of an explanation to your client about how this is now going to change and explaining that to them.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, just take a double, it might be a good time to just. thing anyway, to make sure everything's in line. But yeah, don't go rehashing all of it, but just do a review to make sure everything's in line. And if you are gonna continue to offer cooperative compensation, that's like, go
Just to
ahead.
piggyback on
Yeah.
that, so say you have a house under contract when the changes go into effect, do you have to go back and then do a, not a Cobra, the CSA?
No,
Yeah,
no, you
no,
don't.
you would, okay,
Nope.
okay.
Do it. See already, because, yeah,
Yeah.
that's all for that.
Yeah.
You don't
Okay.
need that's it. The only thing that changes come July is your listings can no longer in the MLS show cooperative compensation or any reference. And you have to have buyer agency agreements before you provide services. That's the only thing in your practice that should be changing. If you're doing things right. Yep. Well, another hand. Yes.
So how are buyers going to sue us when they're living in houses that have
Yeah.
in value? Can we counter sue them?
And that's the hard part is you're out.
Some of us have been doing this for like
Yeah.
15, 20 years, so those people have doubled and tripled in value, so. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
They, like, how soon till they start going after the people that do innovations, and stuff like that?
And getting back to that lawsuit that's, gathering steam right now, are they suing brokers? Are they thinking about suing NAR, or are they thinking about suing individual agents?
Not the agents. Typically the highest pocket, lowest hanging. NAR, larger brokerages, $2 billion or more in revenue brokerages, so.
And is it the same attorney handling that as that did the Missouri?
Yeah, they're all.
So we got a whole new group of people.
They call. It's not the same. Other question? Yes, sir.
We have that's got our back on.
Yeah, it's good.
So that. But at the end of the day, I think when you put it up against, even if you guys hit a home run and knock this out of the park, you would still have to fight this fight probably 10 more times until you would have. The fact that you could get a release for every member of the family, whether or not you fall into the brokerage who's over the $2 billion, you as an individual licensee with that you're released. So there's no liability for any of you, and that was one of their main goals. And I think just casting the net in terms of settlement release as wide as they could, and knowing that they're gonna pay either the bond, they're gonna pay their attorneys, or they're gonna pay the other side at the end of the day. And if they can control that payment, spread it out over a period of term, not have to impact you and continue to focus on providing service, I think that's why they did it. It's never fun, I get it, but they did. I think the frustrating aspect was the lack of communication, even confidentially to some of the association executives, just to say, hey, this is not only a possibility, this is a likelihood of happening. And we're all meeting together on this Wednesday, we could have shared some information, and then, oh, by the way, Friday, everybody finds out together in a news. Not the best thing, but yeah, good question.
Is NAR and PAR and maybe even RAYAC going to do any counter marketing against some of the lawsuit stuff that's out there, the misinformation, the postcards that go out?
So the postcards going
I
out
guess if we
are.
need something stronger
Yeah.
than that's who we are.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the postcards going out are a legal requirement. That is part of the settlement process. There will be more now that this is gonna be, so you're gonna have a whole other batch. And the reason for that is that people will have an opportunity to join the class or to opt out. And if they don't, then now again, if they join the class, the good news is that everybody gets less. Well, I should say the good news. The bad news for the people in the class is everyone gets less.
So
The way they're laying it out, it's about $25 per class member after it.
Right? I think you should.
With that. Is it more? That, hey, you're wrong, or we can sue for additional money. This is just saying you have a statutory timeline based on the settlement, and if you don't do anything, you could lose rights. So you have to. Yes, Rick.
I have a question. Here, and I'm thinking about the vet. And I'm thinking about after the 1st of July. if there is nothing in place that would uh, change for the veteran buyer, what do we do for our clients who are veterans when there's nothing that we can do? Do we really go forward and do we continue to work for them?
Yeah,
But still say, you know, guys, I can't guarantee this, and this. If that's the case, we aren't doing our sincere fiduciary
I
responsibility.
think it's twofold. I think you have an absolute obligation to tell them that something has now changed where we're not gonna know beforehand whether or not that's gonna be offered. Nothing has prohibited that from being offered though. So I'm still gonna do my best to try to negotiate to get that. So a few ways it plays out, even if they're not offering it at the outset, I might be able to negotiate, right? The other thing is that when I have sellers, I'm telling my sellers, when I'm talking to my vet client, I'm telling my sellers that there's an incentive to offering this, right? So that we can have a buyer who otherwise has to stomach all these other costs for an inspection and an appraisal, all these origination and loan fees and everything else, that we can offer a way to make it maybe a little bit more incentivized, either by cooperative compensation or by an incentive. So I think it's kind of relying that, hey, we're all in kind of a good group here in RAYAC and we're all gonna hopefully inform our sellers of that. But the reality to the fiduciary duty, the reality is that they are not obligated to do that. And the reality is if they're not offering it, you're not allowed to pay me. So I can kind of guide you there, but you're not going to be able to show up as the buyer agent because unless you work out an agreement with your E&O insurance, you're not going to have that benefit. You're not getting paid. So I think it's about how you communicate with them and let them know, not that we just need to be maybe a little bit more creative. And that's why I'm glad you're working with me because I'm the guy who's going to work hard to get that done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the same thing would occur with the FHA first time home buyer, where then the concessions that are gonna have to happen for a first time home buyer who has a 640 score with a 43% debt to income ratio won't be getting it done.
Potentially. Now, again, I think the benefit is with the IPCs, it's not gonna be included in that. So your seller, if they're willing, they can offer that as an incentive if they want to make the thing work. And that's not gonna be included in their 3 or 4. Yeah. It's a benefit, I don't know. So I think it's still, it's gonna change the way that stuff is done, but it's just gonna be a little bit more creative in how you communicate and how you negotiate. That's the way it is. And now, again, listing agents, hate to tell you, your job's gonna get harder because now you're going to get 6 offers. Some might be asking for cooperative compensation, some might be asking for seller concession, some both. And now you have to differentiate, sit down with your client who is selling their home for the first time in 30, 40 years, and is gonna say, what, you deal with it, right? You tell me what's working this out. Change the multiple offer comparison sheet to now include cooperative compensation and whether or not, so yeah, your job is gonna change, no doubt, but I think the change of this versus the change that could have been, this is a good potential middle ground because we're still allowed to offer it. VA buyer is not precluded from the market. It's gonna be likely a little bit harder, but not out of the market. Good question.
So the VA buyer does have money, but they're not paying out their.
No.
Not if they want to qualify for the VA. Don't try to get creative. No kidding. That'll be a VA loan violation. Federal issue. Yes.
Obviously, it's gonna be negotiation forward, but in your opinion, is this a good enough offer? And they are, what?
Oh, yeah, they've already, the defendant, their plaintiffs have agreed. Yeah, everyone's in agreement. The only thing is they get to weigh in.
Right.
But I don't think it's good enough for the DOJ, but I think it's good enough for the judge. I think the judge is happy with that. They filed a motion for reconsideration, really pointed out a lot, and NAR did, really pointed out a lot of the procedural defects I think that occurred and should have been rectified, gave them an opportunity to do that. So I think that's kind of lingering in the background that, hey, even if you don't approve this, you're still gonna have to kind of relitigate this whole thing. And there's I think more than an opportunity, a likelihood that even if it goes up on appeal, they're gonna send it back down. So it's gonna land back on his desk again, and now you have to do everything all over again. So I think this is a good way to clear the docket, for lack of a better term, but honestly, that's, your goal as a judge, I know you're looking out for a class of plaintiff and defendant have agreed to resolve it, stay out of the way of the bus, right? Like, let that thing resolve and go that way. But I think, like, very good likelihood it will be resolved. July is a little bit aggressive in terms of timeline, but I think that it eventually will get approved. DOJ will not like it, though. I think they'll put out, just like they did in that MLS pin, say, no, not a fan. Good luck.
Yeah. I think this is a big deal, and I was hoping to be able to ask them. I think it was PAR who released something about sellers saying, hey, we don't want to see this inspection report.
Mhm.
You mind just going over that for everyone in case they didn't read it?
So I don't know about the article, but I'll go over my perspective.
Well, I'll tell you real
Yeah,
quick.
yeah,
I mean,
sure.
it pretty much said like, you're the seller, you say, hey, you can do your inspection, but we do not want this report no matter what. You're still liable for what is in the report. That's what I'm telling you.
I think there's a likelihood now, again. I don't know if push comes to shove, you don't have actual knowledge, like if they're gonna take the position that you'd have constructive knowledge by way of a report that was done. Not for your benefit, but for a buyer potential benefit that had negotiated that they were not gonna provide you a copy of the contract. Maybe it's a little bit different, but I think, again, it depends, I don't know, I'd like to litigate that, to be honest, because I think that they might, depending on the fact they didn't have it. Now, again, it's the opposite, right? Like, oh, I put my head in the sand, I didn't know, I held, you know, but at the end of the day.
Starting in the article was that you do have access to it, all you have to do is accept it.
Yeah.
And just saying, okay, I don't want, I'm not accepting.
To that point, yeah, so if it's not in the contract, yeah, if you say that, that is correct, and the buyer has an obligation actually in the contract to provide. Well, right, so if they don't, I think to that point, yeah.
And the last bit is, we're seeing all this weird language at the bottom in regards to inspections.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this. is an issue.
Yes,
Right.
like buyer inspections are for buyer information purposes only. That doesn't change anything in the contract without having to provide it. The other thing is that you say the ironclad provision, right? That says if the buyer provides the inspection report, it's a default. Buyer will waive his right or her right to get back the deposit money and all this other stuff. And the buyer gives it to you. You still have to provide it because now you have knowledge and what do you do? Even if you lose the $1,000 depositor, now you have to fight about that. If you're trying to sell your home quickly, now you're not there. So again, there's this whole, even during COVID, when homes were flying off the market, everyone's like, oh, I know I had water in the basement, but I really don't want to say anything. And it's like, why? Just do it. It's South Central Pennsylvania. You have water in your basement,
Yeah.
right? That's what happens. So, but I agree with you. I think it depends on how much of a shield you're trying to put over yourself to protect it, that they might say, oh, well, you had access to it. You didn't contract away your right or the obligation not to get it, and therefore you have the knowledge at the end of the day. So, yeah, I'd be very careful how that plays out. Good point. Anybody else? It's lunchtime, right? Sorry, guys.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? Was this helpful? Good. Did a great showing today. I think we had almost 50 on Zoom and 50 here, so that's awesome.
So
Appreciate it.
Peter, you're probably gonna be even busier too.
Yeah.